Hello, my name is Angus Phillips and I'm Director of the Oxford International Centre for Publishing at Oxford Brookes University. Today I'm in conversation with Richard Lennon, who is publisher at Penguin Random House Audio. Previously he was editorial director at Vermilion. So firstly, Richard, thank you very much for sparing the time to talk to me.
Thank you for having me.
And perhaps as a first question, could I ask you to describe your role at Penguin Random House?
Yeah, of course. So I look after a lot of day-to-day stuff in the audio team, which means running our editorial team, which commissions casts and makes creative decisions around audio content. Our production team, which runs our in-house studio and liaises with third-party studios around creating recordings. And we then have an in-house marketing team, which reports to me, and an in-house publishing operations team for audio, who are responsible for file transfer, file delivery, and kind of management of all of our bibliographic data and so on. So I manage those teams. So it's essentially running the day-to-day publishing operations of the audio business.
Okay, and perhaps we could also ask, what have been the general trends in audio over the last few years that you can identify?
I mean, the big one is growth. I think that's the reason that audio is something people still want to talk about at this point. Over the last, I think 5-6 years, you've seen very steady and significant volume growth in audiobook sales in the UK, and that's tracking globally. So, I'll talk more about the UK market, but all the trends that you're seeing here, you are definitely seeing at varying stages of maturity in other English-speaking markets across the world. So the Nielsen data, I think the new batch is out, is suggesting that this is the 6th year in a row of double-digit growth in volume sales in audiobooks, and that's massive. The TCM has been consistently growing in value for print book sales in the UK for the last 2 years, but that has been underpinned by fairly minimal volume growth. So what's going on in audio, I think, is a genuine growth in audience, and the audience is the other big trend that I think is really interesting, because you're seeing a diversification of the audience for books and authors through audio. People who are coming to books and to authors often for the first time, or coming back to reading for the first time since they were much younger, and they're coming to audio because of convenience. And I think that's the other big trend, is the technology that's underpinning the shift to audiobooks. So it has become much easier to access digital audio than it's ever been, and that's largely mobile devices, easy access to decent bandwidth, mobile data networks, and so on. So that's really underpinning all of that growth. And as a result of all of that, there's far more content being produced. So far more titles are available in audio, a much bigger volumes, and also a much broader range. People producing things that probably wouldn't have been considered for an audio edition even a few years ago. So there's a broadening both of the audience and of the content that's available as well.
So you mentioned new audiences. What are the sort of demographics around that? Do you have an idea of those?
I think it's shifting. So when you looked at this a few years ago, you were seeing quite a classic tech early adopter audience. So urban centres, well-educated, fairly affluent, predominantly male commuters, like the kind of classic, people that you would expect to be adapting to a new technology or downloading a new app. Over the last few years, that audience has matured. So every year when those numbers come out, it looks a little bit more like a classic book audience. So the gender balance is roughly neutral, I think, these days. The average age is going up. So that audience is maturing, and I think you're starting to see more people who are kind of more traditional readers pivoting into audio as well. But I think it's significant for the publishing industry that audio does seem to skew younger and male, because it's an audience that publishing in general is not particularly great at reaching. So audio seems to be the primary means of interacting with books for a lot of people who fall into that bracket, and that's one of the things I think is quite important.
So what drove the kind of this growth in audio? Where did it come from? Was it the ability to listen on mobile devices? How has this changed? So what's the thinking behind that? I
think you've probably got a few things going on at once. So I think the mobile device thing is important, and I think it's easy to overlook. There is some point in the last 10 years where it gets cheap enough to buy a high quality smartphone that probably came with a decent pair of headphones, and cheap enough to have a contract with a mobile network that allows you to download the kind of file sizes that audiobooks are, that enables the the demand to sort of be released. The underlying demand, there's a big audience of people for whom long form, well written content is highly appealing, and they are often getting information or entertainment in audiobook form, and they're getting it because it's extremely convenient. You can listen anywhere, you can listen at any point, you can switch between devices, you can start while you're at home cooking your dinner, you can carry on while you're going for a run. In the days where we all commuted, you could do it on the commute, and that was a kind of big listening occasion. So there's those two things in tandem is what kind of creates the underlying demand. And I suppose the two things that are on top of that are actions being taken by people in the industry. Audible have been a phenomenal engine for building demand for audiobooks. Their investment in marketing is extremely substantial, and they've played a big role in expanding that. And you're now seeing, other retailers in a big way, Apple, Google, and some new entrants as well, kind of really starting to build on that. And then on the other side of the equation, publishers producing more and more. We saw this in the US certainly over the past 5 or 6 years. As volumes of what's available in the market increase, it's easier to find what you're looking for as a listener, and that keeps people coming back. So those things are all probably happening in tandem, and they're feeding one another.
And what about smart speakers? Does that have any influence on the market?
So far, probably less than you would imagine. And I think we know that a reasonable chunk of people are listening on smart speakers, but it doesn't feel like what's really driving the growth. And I think if it was, you would see more people optimizing content for smart speakers, which isn't really happening at the moment. I think it's definitely one to watch, and it feels like there are too many big organizations invested in that market for it not to kind of take off in a big way at the moment. But it doesn't really feel like it's had its kind of iPhone moment quite yet. But it feels like you need a really explosive moment. And at the moment, there's a lot of adoption of the devices, but I don't know how much people are using them.
I mean, I was first conscious of growth in audio through podcasts. Has that really influenced the market as well? I mean, there are podcasts everywhere now, aren't there?
Yeah, I think it's driving kind of user behavior, definitely. So we advertise a lot on podcasts. It's a really effective tool for getting to listeners, and I think the idea that it's kind of driving normalizing of listening to spoken word, like often for quite extended periods. I think there's some distinct differences. Like podcasts are free, and podcasts are generally episodic. They don't tend to kind of have a start, a middle, and an end. The majority of podcasts are conversational, and you get the same thing, week in, week out, and it's a similar listening experience every time. So they are quite distinct from audiobooks as a listening experience. So they don't necessarily cross-pollinate all the time, but I think it's definitely driving an awareness in particularly those younger, very digitally savvy audiences who might not be particularly big speech radio listeners and didn't necessarily grow up with speech radio, which is what normalized audiobooks for an older audience. I think it definitely builds that listening behavior around spoken word.
And for audiobooks, what kind of projects work well, do you think?
Quite a big range. I think the most interesting thing for me is the range of things that you can effectively produce as an audiobook is growing quite dramatically, and we're taking on projects now that we probably wouldn't have done 5 years ago, and being able to really successfully produce editions. The classic stuff is celebrity memoirs or biographical works by well-known people. So the Michelle Obama book is a particularly strong recent example, particularly if that's then read by the author, if that's a voice that you know. We've had some success with books that tie into podcasts, going back to your last question, although that isn't a magic bullet, and books that are derived from massive podcasts don't always translate into brilliantly successful audiobooks, but content-wise, it often works. And something like the No Such Thing as a Fish audiobooks that we've done with the QI Elves team have worked really well, and they're a really great listening experience. And then on the fiction side, I tend to think anything that has multiple narrative perspectives will translate really well, because it gives you that kind of license to play with multiple voices, multiple viewpoints, and that can create quite a sort of dynamic listening experience. When you talk to listeners, they often enjoy hearing multiple voices and multiple narrators. And then on the non-fiction side, I've mentioned biography, which is a kind of perennial. We've also seen really, really significant growth in non-fiction over the last few years, and I think there is, there are some subcategories there, sort of personal development self-help, the sort of what I would think of as the kind of smarter end of the self-help market, works really brilliantly. I'd say business works really brilliantly for us in audio, and then the categories that are perennially successful in all formats. So big history works, big sort of smart thinking works tend to perform really nicely for us as well.
And there are different, I mean, you touched on this just now, but there are different kind of productions, aren't there? It might be a single narrator or more theatrical production. So is there quite a lot of playing around with those different formats?
Yeah, there is. And I think if you look at the range of creative decisions that you're making in the course of a project, you're probably starting from, is this one voice or multiple voices? And that's the first decision you'll need to make. If it's one voice, is that the author? In some non-fiction it is, in biographical non-fiction it often is, but it isn't necessarily, and sometimes it would make sense not to make that decision. If it's not the author, there's a whole kind of process around how do you capture that authorial voice. That's true whether it's biographical or anything, particularly non-fiction, the author's normally in there somewhere as part of that voice. So how do you capture that effectively and replicate that on tape? If it's multiple voices, that starts to be a fun casting challenge, and we've had sometimes 15, 20 different voices on projects over the last little while. But also, if you are going down the road of something that does feel, as you say, a bit more drama-like, although these aren't dramas, they're still replications of the exact text of the book. But if you are going down that road, does it also need sound effects? Does it need Foley effects? Does it need sound design? Does it need composition? These are things that audiobook publishers were generally not doing 5-10 years ago, but you will, I think, increasingly see people starting to think about things that can enrich the listening experience even further. And I would say 90% of the time you don't want that, and you want something that just replicates the experience of reading the book on the page. But there are times where it really adds something, particularly for children's books, but also anything where you're trying to replicate the effect of illustrations or something that's kind of enhancing the reading experience on the page. I guess often you're kind of trying to do that with sound, and that's one of the other decisions that you have to make in that process. Okay,
and in terms of the kind of penetration of audio, have you got any idea of where we are in the market for penetration of audio into the book market?
It's a tricky one, because the data's not completely comprehensive, I think, and so you have two good data sets on audiobooks, one that Nielsen produced and one that the Publishers Association produced. But if you're trying to calculate kind of really accurate penetration numbers, I'm not sure that they give you that level of detail. So I think if you're looking at a range between 5 and 10% of the book market, I think being audio, and that's grown significantly over the last 4 or 5 years. I think the number that I'm really interested in is penetration in terms of audience. And I think, again, if you think of it as 90% of the UK public aren't listening to audiobooks at the moment, that gives you a pretty good ballpark. But that also gives you a pretty good sense of how big a growth opportunity there is. And I think that's the target audience that we're looking at the moment, is how do you bring new people into books and new people into reading in its broadest sense.
And we hear a little bit about audio first sometimes, projects designed for the audio market first of all and might go into print later. Are you doing that kind of project?
Yeah, well, we are, and we've had some successes with that. So there was a launch from us last year, which was the Ladybird Audio Adventures series, which won the Future Book of the Year category at the Future Book Awards last year. And those are, they're not even audio first, they're just audio only, essentially. So those are kind of educational stories for children that are written entirely for audio. They sort of take you on a little adventure into the land of dinosaurs or under the sea, with a narrator who kind of acts as your guide. And those are completely done for audio, so they are quite heavily sound designed, lots of music, lots of composition, multiple voices, and so on. So they're a really engaging listen for small children. And we have a project that came out this year, which is a tie-up with the Edinburgh Fringe Festival Society. So because the Edinburgh Fringe wasn't able to take place this year, we created a 20-person audio comedy festival with them. That was 20 short sets from people who would have been performing at this year's Fringe, which again, each is kind of written for audio. So, there's sort of study guides in there. There's some sort of conversational stuff. Most of that is designed purely to work as a listen, as opposed to something that would kind of foreshadow a print publication further down the line. So those are two that I can think of off the top of my head. We've got some more coming next year. So I think it's still quite early days for most publishers with those kind of projects. And I think I'd be wary of suggesting that it's going to be massively transformative for the audio market, but it's definitely something that we are investing in and continuing to pursue.
Okay, thank you. And when users are listening to audiobooks, are they buying one-off titles, or they tend to go more down the subscription model? What's your feeling around that?
I think there's an audience for both. You certainly see Apple's sort of relaunch of their audiobooks business over the last couple of years has been really successful, and that's not a subscription-based platform. So that's buying individual titles, and that has clearly worked, and it seems that they are finding new listeners. So that it feels like they are finding genuine growth from people who want to buy one audiobook at a time, who don't want to commit to a subscription. At the same time, Audible's business is huge, and the dominant model there, it's not the only model they offer, but the dominant model they offer is the sort of token-based subscription model, which has been fantastically successful, and it demonstrates that there's demand from listeners for both approaches, I think. And
there are other players like Storytel, is that right?
Yeah, mostly internationally. So Storytel don't have a business in the UK, I don't think.
No, okay, yeah. And again, we touched on this just now. My feeling is the narrator is quite important to a project, isn't it? And anything that Stephen Fry reads tends to sell really well. So are people choosing on narrators as well?
The sort of the glib answer is yes. And then I think the narrator is really important. And I think if you look at the survey data that we have, consistently the quality of the narration comes out as the top reason for choosing a particular audiobook. So I think listeners are really discerning. It also really matters to the author. Have you got the right voice? Have you got someone that's doing justice to their work? I think that's really important for us as an audio publisher. It's making sure that you've made a creative choice that really captures what the author was trying to do with the book in the first place. And then I think in terms of being able to effectively promote audio editions, great casting can sometimes really lift your campaign. And so bringing in doesn't necessarily have to be a sort of star name. There's a real trend for sort of celebrity casting in audio, which we have been absolutely part of. But I also think sometimes you can find somebody who is early in their career, but is just perfect and sounds phenomenal. And that's really great. So I think it's something that we try and really focus on. We have a big team who our editors spend a lot of their time thinking about casting, and it's not just about being able to attract attention or somebody that has a significant social media following, although those things are great, but it's about, is that person right for the book? Are they going to really get that book perfect? And are they going to prep it properly? Are they going to think it through and work through the text properly? So there's a lot going on in that around narration. It's about production quality. It's about really understanding the text. If you listen to something like, when Michael Sheen reads the Philip Pullman Book of Dust, but he loves the world that Philip Pullman has created so much that you can feel it. I think in the recording, it really comes through, and he invests so much time and energy in the preparation for those recordings that they're an absolute world apart for me. And so that's not just because of who he is, it's partly also because of his connection to the text and how much he loves the work.
Oh, that's really good, really important connection, isn't it? So from your publishing program, what titles have done really well for you? What have been real successes?
We've mentioned a couple of them already, actually. So, the Michelle Obama book has been an absolute runaway success in audio. The next presidential memoir, so the Barack Obama book, Promised Land, is coming out tomorrow at the time of recording, and is already #1 in the Audible charts, which I think is the first time that's happened for a title that's only available on pre-order. We released the Charlie Mackesy The Boy, the Mole, the Fox and the Horse book on Thursday of last week in audio. So that is a really beautiful recording that Charlie created himself, which is has sound. We were talking earlier about sound effects. Has beautiful kind of sound effects from nature. Has some really stunning musical composition in there. It's a really beautiful edition of that that's also been doing really nicely in the charts for us. And then we talked about Stephen Fry, and the new volume of Stephen Fry's Greek Myths series was published recently, and that's been phenomenally successful for us. And then the titles that do well in all formats are always huge in audio as well. So Rich Osmond's Thursday Murder Club has been a real runaway success for us this year, and is continuing to do really well. So when you see those titles that break out in all formats, you will generally see that in audio. The same with the Testaments last year. We've already talked about the Philip Pullman book. So those big kind of event publishing landmark moment books will tend to be big in audio as well.
And do you try to bring the audio edition out at the same time as the print edition?
Yeah. Simultaneously, it will be unless something is unless there is a reason not to, which generally would only be if the author really needs to read it themselves and isn't available. You sometimes find with sports books they'll come out a week or two later because of somebody's training and match schedule or something not allowing them to get into a studio. But I would say the norm these days for all audio publishing is that everything's out on the same day.
And we're talking at a time of lockdown too. So have you picked up any trends around COVID and what people have been listening to this year?
It's tricky to say in some ways. I think that the general trends in growth probably haven't been interrupted that much, and you would think for something that people often associate with commuting, listening on long journeys and so on, it would probably have had a bigger impact on what's happening in the market. It doesn't really feel like that's been the case. There was definitely a big surge in children's audio early in sort of the first lockdown, as we all now seem to be calling it, and that felt quite significant at the time. I think that's probably settled down again now, but there was definitely a big boom, and suddenly the Audible charts were all kids titles for a few weeks. Aside from that, I think it feels like what's working is generally pretty consistent this year with what it's been in the last few years. Partly, I think, because a lot of the disruption in the rest of the market has been around a shift to educational content for children, and that hasn't really quite been replicated in the audio market, I suspect. So it feels like the sort of major disruptions that were happening, the major changes that were happening in other formats kind of didn't quite carry across to us.
Okay, that's brilliant. Well, thanks very much for sparing the time, Richard. And it's been a fascinating journey around the audio market, and good luck with your new projects that are coming out or came out last week. So thank you very much.
No worries. Thank you for having me.